World War I, the war to end all wars. When we think about this war, we think of the suffering and the major advances in technology, including trench warfare, poison gas, and U-boats. But very little is mentioned about African Americans. For African American soldiers, being able to participate in the war was a triumph. They were able to demonstrate their courage, loyalty, and patriotism for their country. However, this came to pass within a system and process that was full of segregation and discrimination. The tragedy was that African Americans were only temporary heroes. Their labor, effort, and lives were used to support the war in Europe. But as soon as they came back to America, they again faced racism, discrimination, violence, and restrictions on their rights and freedoms. This documentary covers a brief history about how the African American troops became a vital part of the conflict and how they fought, in some ways, all for nothing. They were indeed temporary heroes. Some background on the topic. African Americans always faced racism, discrimination, and had to live in the shadow of slavery. Many in America viewed them as property. The Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War finally got rid of slavery. In 1865, the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to black people. Yet, even though they were citizens, they did not get the rights they were promised. In the 1880s, Jim Crow laws were practices, laws, or institutions that served to separate the white people from the black people. They forbade intermarriage and also separated the white people from black people in public areas and facilities. In 1896 came the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Homer Plessy was forced out of his seat in the white section of a train and arrested. His case was taken to the courts, which was then moved up to the Supreme Court. Plessy's lawyer argued that this was unconstitutional since it violated his 13th and 14th Amendment rights. The court ruled that separate facilities were allowed under the Constitution as long as they were equal. Plessy versus Ferguson confirmed that segregation was going to be the way of life in the United States. For the first 15 years of the new century, racism and Jim Crow were everyday realities for African Americans. Across the sea, the war began as tensions grew in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson pledged to keep the United States out of the war since they had no reason to go fight. After Germany continued to have unrestricted warfare and sunk passenger boat full of American citizens, President Wilson felt compelled to act. "We declared war." Wilson proclaimed that the war was to make the world safe for democracy. When America got involved in the war, they noticed that they were short on troops. The Selective Service Act of 1917 was passed on May 18, 1917. African Americans were ready to do their part. About 380,000 African Americans signed up to be able to participate in the war. They signed up to demonstrate that they were just capable and just as loyal to the United States as any other citizen. They went to fight in the hope of obtaining more rights. As said by military historian Ulysses Lee in The Employment of Negro Troops, war gave them a renewed opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty and patriotism. W.E.B. Du Bois urged the African American community to close ranks with their fellow white citizens. The black press encouraged African American patriotism. For example, this poem is written by Roscoe C. Jameson, and it is published in a black newspaper in 1917. These truly are the brave, old memories to walk the bloodstained pave of sacrifice, joining the solemn tide that moves away, to suffer and to die, for freedom when their own is yet denied. O pride, O prejudice, when they pass by, hail them, the brave, for you now crucified. These truly are the free, these souls that grandly rise, above base dreams of vengeance for their wrongs, who march to war with visions in their eyes, of peace through brotherhood, lifting glad songs aforetime. While they front the firing line, stand and behold. They take the field today, shedding their blood like he now held divine, that those who mock might find a better way. The poet comments that the soldiers will fight for freedom they did not have back at home. Instead of vengeance, they have visions of peace through brotherhood. They are prepared to sacrifice themselves like Jesus to show that they are equal to whites. There was little doubt among Negroes during World War I that the record of the loyalty and courage of their soldiers would have been preserved in France and that peace would be followed by gains in status and opportunity. The African Americans started signing up. They were being assigned to different regiments away from the white soldiers. Most of them were assigned to do manual labor and not actually fight in the war. The U.S. Army was reluctant to place them in combat, and many were sent to fight with the French. There were some editorial cartoons that spoke about this extreme move by the U.S. Army. Analyzing this editorial cartoon, the box has a tag that says to France, which refers to the troops being sent to France. It also has a label on the side that talks about the problems in the United States, such as racism, hatred, prejudice against colored U.S. troops. The artist is commenting on how America is sending its hateful ways across the sea to French. However, the French were much more liberal, treated them with amiableness, and respected them as men. According to Chad Williams, a historian in African American military history, service in France constituted a remarkable experience. African American troops often interacted with North and West African soldiers, serving in the French military, expanding their sense of diasporic belonging. Black soldiers received a warm welcome from the French civilians who, unlike the white troops of the American army, exhibited little overt racism. They treated us with respect, one soldier recalled, not like the white American soldiers. There was plenty of evidence that when the African American soldiers fought, they fought well. For example, the Harlem Hellfighters is a regiment of African Americans that were lucky enough to be able to fight in the war. I have been with the colored troops for 25 years, and I have never seen a better soldier. The participation of the Harlem Hellfighters was a triumph in itself since they fought bravely. Private Henry Johnson is one of the most well-known soldiers from the Harlem Hellfighters. He was able to fight off more than a dozen enemy troops while injured one night on patrol, and managed to prevent getting captured by the Germans. He was also able to save his friend as he was about to be killed and taken by the Germans.
But the reality was that most African Americans serving in the war, especially those not serving with the French in the 92nd, were still looked down upon and given jobs of manual labor like slaves. In fact, some studies show that about 80% of African American soldiers were used to do manual labor and only about 20% were in combat. When the African Americans came back to the United States, they expected to be granted more rights than before, but they came back to a nation still invested in discrimination. First of all, they did not get war recognition and did not get to participate in the main war victory parade. They made their own parade in Harlem, which was at least a chance for them to be recognized by their own community. Secondly, the summer of 1919 was full of violence and riots against African Americans, therefore it being named the Red Summer. There were violent protests. As a result of these events, African Americans were killed and injured. A lot of African American soldiers were lynched and others were even lynched in their military uniforms. In the face of the setbacks they encountered after the war, colored people protested and became socially active in movements for equality. Some of these movements were the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the NAACP, and the socialist magazine, The Messenger. Movements for better rights were not successful in the 1920s through the 1940s. African Americans fought again in World War II, but it was still full of segregation and discrimination. In 1948, the President issued Executive Order 9981 to desegregate the military. The order read, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regards to race, color, religion, or national origin." Although this order began the process of desegregation in the military, the separate but equal laws were still in effect in regular society. Finally, in 1954, they had the Brown versus Board of Education decision that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. That ended the legal basis of segregation. After that, the civil rights movement gained momentum. Progress started happening to dismantle racism and segregation.
Many of the soldiers who served in World War I did not live to see the fruits of their sacrifice. The historical significance of my topic is how African Americans were able to be a part of one of the biggest conflicts in history. Tragically, they faced racism, discrimination, and segregation, the things they went to fight to try to change when they went to prove themselves. They were temporary heroes. Since they were used in the war and they came back to America, they were still treated unjustly. Today, we can look back at their sacrifice with pride and realize that even temporary heroes are heroes just the same.